My name is Evelyn Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and at the time this happened, I was a forensic accountant in Houston, Texas. 14 days before my stepmother lost everything, she sat 3 feet away from me in courtroom 4B of the Harris County Probate Court and told a judge I did not know what day it was. My face did not move, but I could feel my pulse in my teeth. She said I could barely dress myself. She said I called her confused at 2 a.m. and forgot entire conversations. She said it softly, with a tissue in one hand and my dead father's credit card hanging from her wrist in the form of a Cartier watch he had bought her 2 Christmases before he died. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I folded my hands in my lap and counted silently to 14. That was how many days she had left before the first indictment came down. Before I continue, if you end up liking this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with it. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the spring before my father died, when everything started to shift in a way I did not understand yet. My family had always been the kind that looked polished from a distance. We were not loud. We were not chaotic in the way people recognize right away. We were pressed shirts, trimmed hedges, conservative jewelry, thank you notes on heavy paper. We were the kind of family that hosted Easter brunch on white serving platters and spoke in lowered voices about other people's messes as if tragedy were proof of poor breeding. That image mattered to my father. His name was Robert Calloway, and for most of my life he had been a sort of man people trusted instinctively. He had broad hands, a gentle voice, and the habit of listening a few seconds longer than other people did. He was not flashy. He did not need to be. My grandfather had built a commercial real estate trust in 1974, starting with one weathered retail strip outside Houston and turning it, over 3 decades, into office properties, medical suites, and mixed-use leases that threw off steady income in every quarter. By the time it came down to my father, it was structured, conservative, boring in the best possible way. Boring money survives. That was something my father used to say. My mother died when I was 11 years old. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Cruel. Efficient. She was diagnosed in February and gone by October at 5:18 in the morning while the nurses changed shifts and the hallway outside her room smelled like coffee and antiseptic. Her name was Marisol Reyes Calloway. She had been the first in her family to finish college, and she moved through life with a kind of quiet certainty I did not appreciate enough when I had it. She made lists in blue pen. She labeled shelves. She folded towels into exact thirds. She kissed my forehead every morning before school, even when she was tired. There are some losses that split time cleanly in half. Before my mother. After my mother. 8 months after the funeral, my father married Diane. Diane Marie Calloway arrived in our lives with blonde highlights, glossy lipstick, a real estate license she almost never used, and a smile so warm it took me years to understand it was a tool. She was 36 when she married him. I was 11 and still sleeping with the lamp on. My father was drowning in grief, and Diane did what smart opportunists do around grieving men with money. She did not push. She organized. She remembered names. She sent soup when people were sick. She brought casseroles to church functions and called everyone sweetheart in a tone that made them feel chosen. She did not replace my mother. She replaced the atmosphere around her. At first, even I wanted to believe she was trying. That part matters because people always assume victims of manipulation know immediately what is happening. Most of us do not. Most of us are too busy hoping we are wrong. When I was 12, Diane redecorated the house in River Oaks. My mother's pottery disappeared first. Then the woven throw from Oaxaca she kept over the back of the den sofa. Then the framed black and white photos from my parents' first apartment. Diane said the house needed to feel lighter. She said grief had a visual weight, and she wanted to make the rooms breathe again. I remember standing in the breakfast nook at 4:40 p.m., still in my school uniform, watching a moving company carry out a cedar chest that had belonged to my maternal grandmother. Diane smiled and said, "We're just making room for a fresh start." At 13, I learned not to ask where things had gone. At 14, I asked my father for help applying to a summer academic program at Rice. It cost $1,800. Diane stood at the kitchen island in white capri pants and said that seemed a little indulgent for a teenager when there were free options online. 2 months later, she hosted a charity luncheon in our backyard and spent $7,400 on florals, rentals, and catered salmon she picked at with a tiny silver fork while telling guests how important it was to invest in young women. At 15, I wanted braces because 2 of my front teeth overlapped. Diane said character mattered more than vanity. That December, her birthday gift from my father was a diamond tennis bracelet that cost $11,600. At 17, my cousin Derek got a used BMW for graduation. Diane said it was important for boys to project confidence. I got a monogrammed Bible and a lecture about humility. At 18, I earned admission to the University of Texas with a scholarship package that covered most of tuition. I needed $9,300 for housing and books. Diane told my father I would value my education more if I had to work for it. That same year, she convinced him to loan her brother $42,000 for a restaurant that closed in 11 months. The hierarchy was never spoken aloud. That was what made it so effective. There was no dramatic announcement that I ranked below her comfort, her image, her extended family, her taste, or her appetite. It was simply embedded into 1,000 small decisions until I stopped expecting fairness and started translating neglect into something I could live with. Practicality. Timing. Maybe next year. That is how some children survive families that prefer them manageable. The person who saw it clearly was my mother's older sister, Elena. Aunt Elena lived in San Antonio and smelled like sandalwood and orange peel. She wore linen in the summer and drove a dented Subaru she refused to replace because, as she liked to say, debt was just stress with better marketing. She was the one adult in my life who asked direct questions and stayed quiet long enough to hear the real answer. When I was 16, I spent a week at her house after a fight with Diane over college applications. We ate tomatoes with salt over her sink because they were too ripe for proper slicing. The kitchen fan rattled. A thunderstorm rolled in around 7:12 p.m., and she stood beside me drying dishes with a faded towel while I tried very hard not to cry. She does not have to hit you to control the room, Aunt Elena said. I stared at the sink. She just has to teach everyone else to doubt what they saw. At the time, I thought that sounded too sharp, too cynical. I still wanted to believe adults eventually sorted themselves into truth. I understand now that Elena was trying to give me language early. She died of a cerebral aneurysm when I was 27. What she left me was not money. It was pattern recognition. By then I had built a life that looked, from the outside, steady. I was not married. I did not have children. I had an apartment in Montrose, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and the kind of work most people find unbearably dry. I spent 6 years with a firm that specialized in forensic audits and fraud tracing, bankruptcy diversion, embezzlement, vendor padding, shell structures, sweetheart contracts, men who thought 3 LLCs and a wire ladder made them invisible, women who moved money slowly because they believed small theft looked like accounting noise. I was good at it, not because I was brilliant, because I was patient. Patience is unbearable to people who rely on performance. My father had his first major cardiac episode in late August, 14 months before the hearing. I remember the date because it was August 28th and Houston was so hot the parking garage at Houston Methodist felt like a hairdryer. He called me himself at 2:16 p.m. from the hospital. His voice sounded embarrassed more than frightened. He said he was fine. He said doctors were overreacting. He said Diane was handling things. I left work anyway. When I got there, Diane was not in the room. She was in the hallway near the vending machines talking in a low voice to someone I later learned was his financial advisor. She had one arm folded over her waist and the other hand touching her cheek the way women do when they want to look fragile. She did not see me at first. I heard only one sentence clearly. Well, if we need to move quickly, I'd rather understand the accounts before he gets sentimental. Before he gets sentimental. Those were her words. My father survived that episode. For a while, things settled. Medications. Rehab. Diet restrictions he hated. Diane performed concern beautifully. green juices, supplement organizers, careful updates to relatives. She became indispensable to people who were not paying close attention. Then, in March, he had a stroke. It was a Tuesday, 6:03 a.m. My phone rang while it was still dark. The sound of it on the nightstand felt violent. Diane was crying before I even said hello. She told me they were taking him into the ICU. She said I needed to hurry. The freeway was almost empty. The city looked washed out in that pre-dawn blue that makes glass buildings seem temporary. He died at 6:47 a.m. I was holding his hand when he went. Diane was not in the room. She was in the waiting area, on her phone, contacting his financial advisor. That fact sat in me like a stone from the first day. I did not understand all of it yet. I just knew it mattered. Grief is disorienting, but paper has a way of cutting through fog. For days after the funeral, at 9:14 a.m., I sat in the conference room of my father's estate attorney and learned 3 things that changed the shape of my life. The first was that my father had updated his will 18 months earlier. He left the River Oaks house to Diane outright. He left her personal effects allowances, a vehicle, and a cash distribution large enough that no reasonable person could call her abandoned. But the trust, the commercial holdings, investment accounts, and operating entities worth approximately $4.2 million passed to me as successor beneficiary and controlling trustee. The second was that someone had accessed his private desk file at home 4 months before his death. The attorney did not say Diane directly, but he told me my father had mentioned finding a drawer disturbed after a cardiology appointment. He had assumed it was housekeeping. I knew better. The third was the one that turned sorrow into a different kind of attention. The trust's operating account showed a series of transfers that did not match rent sweeps, maintenance reserves, tax disbursements, or vendor obligations. Not one huge theft. A pattern. $5,200. Then $7,900. Then $11,400. Then $4,850. Small enough to avoid alarm. Large enough to accumulate. By the date of my father's death, a little over $310,000 had been moved into entities the attorney could not immediately identify. Most people think the worst moment in betrayal is the discovery. For me, it was the understanding. Diane had not acted in panic after my father died. She had been preparing while he was still alive. That changes a person. Because opportunism is ugly, but premeditation is intimate. I left the attorney's office at 10:52 a.m. and sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel. The leather was hot. I could hear landscaping crews outside, the whine of blowers rising and falling. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I stared through the windshield and felt something colder than grief settle into place. I knew 2 things from my work. First, money leaves a story behind. Second, the people who steal it almost always believe the bigger theft is not the funds. It is the narrative. Take the money, then take the victim's credibility. Once you make them sound unstable, paranoid, vindictive, or greedy, the evidence has to climb uphill through everyone's doubt. That was Diane's real talent. She did not just want access. She wanted legitimacy. So I did the opposite of what she expected. I became smaller. I moved out of the apartment my father had been partially helping me pay for and into a studio in Montrose that cost $800 a month. I drove my old Civic. I stopped buying lunch out. I wore jeans, black t-shirts, and shoes with worn soles. I went to family dinners. I let Diane hug me for photographs. I let her say things like, "Your father would want us close, sweetheart," while I nodded like someone still too stunned to think clearly. At 8:41 every night, after I got home, I put water on for coffee and opened my laptop. The folder on my desktop was called Family. That was my first screenshot. I started with the easy layer, outgoing wires. 47 transfers over 11 months. The amounts varied, but the rhythm did not. None of them aligned with recurring obligations. All cleared through the same user credentials tied to an administrative access route my father almost never used himself. The account authorizations had been changed 123 days before his death. 2-factor notifications had been redirected to a backup device ending in 4417. That phone belonged to Diane. What happened next changed everything. I traced the recipient entities one by one. Bluebird Properties LLC, Gulf Horizon Consulting, Legacy Asset Management. 3 separate companies incorporated in Wyoming through the same registered agent service, all formed within 29 days of one another. That was not sophisticated. That was seminar fraud. The kind of structure people build when they have read just enough online to feel clever and not enough to understand how many breadcrumbs incorporation leaves behind. I pulled public corporate records at 11:26 p.m. on a Thursday night and felt my stomach drop when I saw the organizer addresses. 2 mail drops. 1 nominee filing contact. 1 document preparer using an IP range linked to a home network in River Oaks. I screenshot everything. Timestamp. Source. User path. I saved each file twice. Then I looked deeper. The money did not stay in those shell accounts long. It sat for 30 to 60 days, sometimes less, then moved again into a personal brokerage account at Charles Schwab held jointly by Diane Calloway and Trevor Fisk. Trevor Fisk was a real estate agent in Galveston with 2 eye teeth, polo shirts stretched a little tight over his stomach, and the kind of social media page men use when they want to look busy instead of successful. I did not know him personally, but I recognized him from one of Diane's charity events 2 years earlier. At the time, he had introduced himself as someone helping a friend source coastal investment property. Diane had laughed too brightly at something he said. I still remember that laugh because my father had been standing right there. I opened Trevor's business records at 12:14 a.m. and found a lease guarantee on a beachfront condo signed by both Trevor and Diane 11 months before my father died. Not after. Before. He never saw it coming. That sentence is usually written about villains. Sometimes it belongs to decent men who mistake devotion for care. I sat back in my kitchen chair and listened to the refrigerator hum. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee and paper dust. My hands were trembling now, though I could not have said whether from rage or the adrenaline that comes when instinct turns into proof. At 2:47 a.m., I sat on my bathroom floor with my laptop open and let the whole pattern line up in my head. Affair. Account access. Shell companies. Layered transfers. A future asset purchase. And a widow already preparing to call herself vulnerable. I was not the only person who needed to see it. That was when I called Daniel Voss. Daniel was an estate litigator I knew through one of our fraud matters at work. 52 years old. Immaculate shoes. Calm voice. Never wasted a word. He had spent 23 years in probate disputes and family trust fights, which meant he had one of the rarest professional skills in the country, the ability to listen to insane-sounding family dynamics without looking surprised. He answered on the 4th ring. "It's 2:49, he said. "I know. That usually means either prison or blood. Potentially both." There was a pause. "Talk." I gave him the short version. Father deceased. Stepmother. Transfers. Shells. Probable affair. Suspicious pre-death access. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he said, "Do not accuse her. Do not confront her. Send me everything by 7 a.m. and do not tell a single relative what you found." I already wasn't going to. "Good," he said. "People like this do not stop when cornered. They escalate. We need her comfortable." Comfortable. That was the word he used. I did not know it then, but that phone call would destroy her. Daniel became my ally in the way serious adults do, without theatrics. By noon the next day, he had looped in a digital forensics consultant named Priya Shah and a probate clerk he trusted enough to ask procedural questions without advertising strategy. Priya was precise in a way I found instantly comforting. She wore no jewelry except a plain wedding band and spoke about device logs the way surgeons speak about tissue carefully, cleanly, without ego. At our first meeting for 18 p.m. in Daniel's office, she scrolled through a spreadsheet of transfer metadata and said, "She is sloppier than she thinks." That's helpful. Helpful. I almost laughed. Over the next 5 months, I lived 2 lives. By day, I worked cases, filed reports, answered emails, and functioned. By night, I built a private archive that would have made a federal prosecutor smile. Text screenshots, account logs, corporate records, backup authentication changes, IP routes, device identifiers, calendar overlaps, even social media evidence placing Diane in Galveston on days she claimed to be sitting beside my father during treatment consults. At 9:41 a.m. one Saturday, I opened an old iPad my father had used primarily for golf scores and found a synced email account Diane must have assumed he never checked. That was where I discovered her first unguarded line in writing. She had forwarded a bank confirmation to Trevor with the message, "She won't fight it." She never fights anything. I stared at that sentence for a very long time. Not because it hurt, because it clarified the role she had assigned me in her own head. Passive. Compliant. Grateful for scraps. The girl who went quiet instead of difficult. I screenshot it and saved it in a subfolder called Assumptions. What I found next destroyed her. The conservatorship plan did not appear all at once. It surfaced in pieces. First, Diane began making comments at family dinners. "You seem tired, sweetheart. You already told me that. Are you sleeping at all?" Always soft. Always in front of witnesses. Then she started calling relatives. I know because Aunt Colette repeated one of Diane's lines to me almost word for word at Easter brunch. "Honey, Diane says you've been so overwhelmed you're forgetting to pay bills." I looked at her. "I'm not forgetting bills." Colette blinked and smiled too quickly. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing." It was never nothing. At 6:22 p.m. on May 11th, Diane left me a voicemail that lasted 1 minute and 43 seconds. Her voice was syrupy. She said she was so worried because I had sounded confused earlier in the week, and she just wanted to make sure I knew she would help me with all the hard financial stuff until I felt like myself again. I had not spoken to her that week. I saved the voicemail. At 11:03 a.m. 3 days later, Priya found that a psychologist named Dr. Edwin Marsh had been billing consultation hours to Diane's private legal account. No patient file. No appointment schedule. No direct contact with me. Just invoices coded as cognitive capacity review. Daniel leaned back in his chair when he read that and said, "There it is. The playbook. Make the victim look unstable. Then present theft as rescue. Stay with me. It gets worse." By June, Diane was laying groundwork with almost artistic confidence. She told relatives I had become erratic. She said I wandered during conversations. She said grief had broken something in me. One cousin claimed she heard I had shown up at the River Oaks house at midnight crying. I had not. Another said Diane was afraid I might hurt myself. I was not. That rumor traveled so fast I understood, maybe for the first time, how little evidence most people require when the story is emotionally satisfying. A distressed young woman is believable. A calculating widow with polished nails and church friends is believable. An ugly truth is not. So I stayed calm. That was the hardest part. Not the tracing. Not the documentation. The stillness. I sat through Sunday lunches while Diane passed roasted potatoes and touched my wrist sympathetically. I sat across from people who shared my last name and watched them look at me with that careful brightness families use when they think fragility might shatter under direct handling. I said little. I smiled when expected. I let silence do what silence does best. It made her overconfident. At 3:08 p.m. on a Wednesday in January, Daniel called. She filed. I was standing in line for coffee. The cafe smelled like espresso and cinnamon syrup. For one strange second, the room sharpened. Cups. Pastry case. A girl in a green sweater stirring oat milk into tea. The ordinary world did not know it had split. What exactly? Emergency conservatorship petition. Temporary appointment request over you and the trust. She's claiming mental incapacity and financial deterioration. She attached a report from Edwin Marsh. He never examined you. I closed my eyes. Good, I said. Daniel went quiet. Good. Yes. Because once she filed, she put theory into record. Once she signed under oath, she turned manipulation into exposure. Once she submitted forged support, if she submitted forged support, she crossed from poison into felony. That was his first mistake. Her second mistake was thinking humiliation would rattle me more than theft. The hearing was set for the following Wednesday morning in courtroom 4B. The 6 days before it were some of the longest of my life. I did not sleep properly. I woke at 3 a.m. twice with my heart racing. I threw up once in the sink after brushing my teeth because the body does not care how calm the mind sounds. I kept going anyway. I prepared like I prepared every serious case I had ever touched. Chronology first, then supporting documents, then cross-reference maps, then human behavior. Because evidence matters, but sequence persuades. I built a black binder just over 200 pages thick. Red tabs for trust transfers and bank statements. Blue for digital forensics and IP logs. Green for corporate filings and shell ownership structures. Yellow for the forged letter and expert report on signature manipulation. White for procedural references and the applicable statutes Daniel expected the court would care about most. I also prepared emotionally. That may sound vague, but it was not. On Tuesday night at 8:12 p.m., I laid out my clothes with the care people usually reserve for funerals and interviews. Navy blazer, ivory shell, charcoal trousers, low black heels I could stand in for hours, my mother's pearl studs. Nothing flashy. Nothing that looked like costume strength. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, competent, rested, untheatrical, impossible to dismiss once the paper came out. I put the binder in a plain black tote. Inside the front pocket, I tucked a second folder with certified copies. And then I sat in my apartment on the edge of the bed with verdict, yes. Later there would be a dog, but not yet, no, that is wrong. There was no dog then. Just silence and the sound of a neighbor's television bleeding faintly through the wall. I remember looking at my hands under the lamp and thinking they did not look like the hands of a woman about to publicly dismantle her stepmother. They looked ordinary. That comforted me. Ordinary hands can still hold evidence. I know this is a lot. If this story is hitting you hard, you're not alone. Thousands of people have lived some version of this quiet betrayal. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this ends, and tell me in the comments, what would you have said right there? Courtrooms have their own weather. Cold air. Recycled paper. Dust trapped in carpet. Voices kept just beneath their natural level until emotion leaks through and every sound suddenly carries. That Wednesday morning, the gallery was fuller than I expected. Aunt Colette was there with her 2 daughters. Cousin Gerald, one of Diane's church friends. A woman I later learned was her hairdresser, brought in as seat-filling moral support. Curtis Hamley, Diane's attorney, had chosen a suit one size too tight and an expression that suggested he enjoyed the theater of incompetence proceedings. Diane sat beside him in cream wool and pearls, the Cartier watch glinting against her wrist every time she dabbed at her eyes. Judge Alderman entered at 9:03 a.m. He was silver-haired, early 60s, and had the face of a man who had watched too many families weaponize concern. I liked him immediately for the fatigue around his eyes. It suggested realism. Curtis went first. He spoke in that oiled legal tone men use when they want to sound both grave and tender. He described my decline. He cited missed payments, confused calls, emotional instability, impaired judgment. He said the trust had lost over $310,000 under my management. He said Diane had stepped in only because she had promised my father she would care for me if anything ever happened. Then Dr. Marsh's report was summarized. Severe dissociative symptoms. Cognitive decline. Compromised executive functioning. Based on what? Not examination. Not testing. Not interview. Based on Diane. That fact alone would have offended me if I had allowed myself room for offense. Instead, I took notes. Then Diane testified. She looked toward the judge, not me. That was deliberate. Predators' no eye contact with the real target can reveal too much. She doesn't even know what day it is, Your Honor. Tissue dab. She can barely dress herself. Small inhale. She calls me confused in the middle of the night. Hand to chest. I'm terrified for her. I made a promise to her father. Every line landed exactly where she wanted it to. Soft. Maternal. Patient. The gallery leaned with her. I could feel it. The whole room settling into a story they had already half accepted before they walked in. Curtis stood again. Your Honor, we are requesting immediate appointment of Mrs. Diane Calloway as temporary conservator over the estate and related trust assets to prevent further financial deterioration caused by the respondent's inability to manage her affairs. Judge Alderman looked at me over his glasses. Miss Calloway, these are serious allegations. How do you respond? The room went quiet. Diane leaned forward. Curtis clicked his pen. Aunt Colette held her breath. They wanted tears. They wanted defensive outrage. They wanted a shaking woman talking too fast. They wanted the version of me Diane had been building for months. I stood up slowly. I buttoned my blazer. I looked directly at Diane. Not at the judge. Not at the gallery. At her. 3 seconds. 5. No blink. Her mouth tightened just enough for me to know she felt the first shift. Then I turned to Judge Alderman and said, I'm listening, Your Honor. I just wanted to make sure my stepmother was finished. I wouldn't want to interrupt her while she's still under oath. The courtroom changed temperature. It is difficult to explain unless you have watched power reverse in real time. Nothing visible happens at first. No one gasps. No one stands. It is subtler. A collective recalculation. People do not yet know why they are uneasy. They only know the role they were expecting has not been played correctly. Curtis recovered first. Your Honor, we also have financial records showing a pattern of neglect and mismanagement. He handed a folder to the bailiff. Judge Alderman opened it and began turning pages. His pen stopped moving. That was when Diane made her mistake. She doesn't even check her statements, she said. I had to find this myself. Over $300,000 gone. And she had no idea. I let 5 seconds pass. Long enough for the gallery to murmur. Long enough for Diane to feel safe inside her own performance. Then I said, Your Honor, may I approach the bench? He nodded. I picked up the black binder and carried it forward. It felt heavier than it was, not because of paper, but because of months. I set it in front of him and opened to the first red tab. I didn't lose track of $310,000, Your Honor, I said. I watched every dollar leave. I know exactly where it went, when it went, and who sent it. Diane's face held. Her hands did not. Her fingers locked around the edge of counsel table until the knuckles blanched. These are the wire confirmations from the Calloway Family Trust operating account, I said. 47 transfers over 11 months to 3 entities, Bluebird Properties LLC, Gulf Horizon Consulting, and Legacy Asset Management. I turned a page. All 3 were incorporated in Wyoming through the same registered agent service. Their beneficial owner, as identified through confidential filing records obtained through counsel, is Diane Marie Calloway. Curtis was on his feet. Objection, I kept going. The woman asking this court to declare me incompetent is the same woman who has already been siphoning money out of the trust. The courtroom erupted. Aunt Colette gasped. Someone behind her whispered, Oh my God. Curtis was speaking, but the room had moved beyond him for a second. Even the hairdresser looked stunned. Diane snapped first. That's a lie. She fabricated that. This is exactly what I've been saying. She's paranoid. Judge Alderman raised one hand. Silence. Not the soft silence from before. A harder one. He looked at Diane with the expression of a man who had just realized somebody was trying to use his courtroom as a laundering mechanism. Continue, Miss Calloway. I flipped to the blue tab. These are the IP logs associated with each transfer. Every single one originated from the same device fingerprint tied to a Dell Inspiron laptop using the home network at 1847 Willow Creek Lane. I glanced toward Diane. That is my stepmother's home address. Curtis tried again, voice thinner now. This evidence has not been properly authenticated. It has, Daniel said for the first time from counsel table beside me. His voice was quiet. And certified copies are available for the record. Judge Alderman held out his hand for them. I moved to the green tab. Here are the bank statements for the shell entities. You'll notice the same pattern every time. Money flows from the trust, remains parked between 30 and 60 days, then transfers into a Charles Schwab brokerage account jointly held by Diane Calloway and Trevor Fisk. I paused. Diane's lips parted. Would you like to tell the court who Trevor Fisk is? I asked, or should I? Nothing. Her throat moved. Mr. Fisk is a real estate agent based in Galveston. He and Mrs. Calloway have been in a personal relationship for approximately 3 years. That relationship began while my father was still alive. I have hotel receipts, text message records, and a lease agreement for a beachfront condo co-signed by both parties. I heard someone in the gallery make a small choking sound. This condo, I said, was funded in part with money stolen from the trust. The silence that followed was extraordinary. It was not uncertainty anymore. It was recognition. Aunt Colette had tears in her eyes, but she was no longer looking at Diane. She was looking at me the way people look at a person they misjudged and now cannot bear to fully meet. Judge Alderman removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. That was the moment from the title. The moment the room understood there was a second story under the first one, and it was the real one. Then he looked directly at Diane. Mrs. Calloway, did you file this petition knowing you were the source of the transfers? Curtis grabbed her forearm. Do not answer that. But Diane was already coming apart. It's not what it looks like, she said too quickly. I was managing the funds. Robert wanted me to. He gave me authority before he died. I had been waiting for that. Yellow tab. My stepmother submitted a letter with her petition, I said, purporting to grant her broad authority over the trust. It appears at page 14 of the filing. It is dated 3 months before my father's death and bears his signature. Curtis went pale. I had that letter examined by a certified forensic document examiner. The report is behind this tab. The signature is a digital copy lifted from a 2023 property tax filing and pasted into the letter using image editing software. Metadata from the PDF shows the file was created 4 days after my father died on a computer registered to Curtis Hanley's law office. Curtis slammed a palm on the table. This is outrageous. The letter is a forgery, I said, looking at the judge. Submitted under oath in support of a fraudulent conservatorship petition. I could actually hear Curtis breathing. Judge Alderman looked at him for a long time. Mr. Hamley, he said, did you prepare that document? No answer. There are moments when guilt becomes visible, not as confession, as collapse. Curtis's face seemed to melt at the edges. Sweat darkened the underarms of his shirt. His mouth opened, then closed. Diane turned on him instantly. He told me it would hold up, she hissed, pointing. He said no one would check. That was the part no performance can survive. The alliance breaking in public. 2 thieves in a sinking boat, each trying to climb onto the other. I didn't want this, Diane said to the gallery, voice cracking now. Robert was going to leave me with nothing. After everything I did. 17 years. I raised his daughter. I kept his house. You kept his money, I said. That's what you kept. For the first time in my life, I watched her look genuinely afraid. Not offended. Not indignant. Afraid. I know some of you are furious on my behalf. If this hits close to home, tap that like button. The confrontation is here, and this is the moment everything turned. Judge Alderman lifted his hand again. Silence. Then he spoke in the tone people use when they have stopped entertaining illusion. This court finds no evidence of mental incapacity on the part of the respondent, Miss Calloway. The petition for conservatorship is denied with prejudice. Curtis sat down hard. Diane stared forward. Judge Alderman continued. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the forged document and the fraudulent petition to the Harris County District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. He looked at Diane. Mrs. Calloway, I strongly suggest you retain separate criminal counsel. Mr. Hamley will not be able to represent you, as he appears to be implicated in the same matter. Then he looked back at me. You mentioned multiple state jurisdiction? Yes, Your Honor. Wyoming shell entities. Texas brokerage activity. Interstate wire transfers used in connection with a Galveston property lease and related funding path. He nodded once. I will also be making a referral to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Texas. This may qualify as interstate wire fraud. Diane's face emptied. That is the only way I can describe it. Not shock. Not sorrow. A sort of psychic blainness. The expression of someone realizing the trap they built required one final signed filing, and they themselves had supplied it. My hands were steady when I sat down. My heart was steady too. I felt like a runner at the end of a brutal race. Exhausted. Clear. Done with movement, because there was finally no need to run anymore. The hearing ended, but the real aftermath began in the hallway. Courtrooms release people in layers. Lawyers first, then families, then stragglers who need gossip more than oxygen. I stood near the window at the far end of the hall, where winter light pooled on the tile in pale squares, and waited for Daniel to finish with the clerk. Aunt Colette approached me with both hands clasped too tightly in front of her purse. She was crying. "Sweetheart," she said. "I didn't know." "She told us, I know what she told you," I said. And I did. That was the thing. I was not angry at Colette in that moment. Not really. Angry at systems, maybe. At family laziness. At how easily people outsource judgment when a polished liar offers emotional certainty. But not at Colette. Narcissists do not just manipulate victims. They manipulate witnesses. They build an alternate reality so convincing that even decent people can get trapped inside it, especially if believing it costs them less than questioning it. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. The answer had been sitting in me for months. Because I needed you to believe her. Colette blinked. If anyone had challenged her too early, she would have adjusted. She would have changed tactics. She needed a full audience. She needed a courtroom. She needed this filed under oath. That was the only way the forgery became more than rumor. Colette stared at me for a long second. "You planned this." "I planned for the possibility," I said. "There's a difference." Then I stepped outside. Houston in January is strange. Cold enough for a jacket. Warm enough to suggest mercy might still exist somewhere nearby. I stood on the courthouse steps at 10:41 a.m. and took the deepest breath I had taken in 14 months. It tasted like cold air and old stone and freedom. The next 3 weeks were administrative on the surface and seismic underneath. Search warrants. Freezes. Subpoenas. Daniel kept me informed carefully, never dramatically. Priya sent updates and clipped, elegant emails with subject lines like device correlation confirmed and PDF metadata preserved. The trust accounts were temporarily shielded. The brokerage account was frozen. The Galveston condo lease arrangements were examined. Additional communications surfaced between Diane, Trevor, and Curtis that made the original hearing look almost modest by comparison. At 8:17 a.m. 21 days later, Diane was indicted on 6 counts. Theft from an estate, forgery, aggravated perjury, securing execution of a document by deception, money laundering, 1 federal wire fraud count. Curtis Hanley was indicted separately on conspiracy and tampering-related charges. Trevor Fisk was named as an unindicted co-conspirator and later cooperated when the government made it clear beach condos and polo shirts did not constitute legal insulation. Diane called me that afternoon from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something in me wanted to hear what her real voice sounded like without an audience. I answered. "You ruined my life," she said. No tears. No softness. No maternal register. Just venom laid flat. I looked out my office window at the parking lot below. A man was loading boxes into the back of a truck. Somewhere down the hall, a printer started up. "No, Diane," I said. "You built a house on someone else's land. I just showed up with the deed." She hung up. I blocked that number. Then 3 more over the next 9 days. Because people like Diane do not stop when they lose. They just change the angle of attack. Some family members called to apologize. Some called to defend themselves. One cousin left a voicemail saying he had always known something was off, which was an interesting revisionist performance given that he had nodded along in court like a dashboard ornament. My father's old financial advisor sent a statement through counsel and quietly retired within 6 months, which told me all I needed to know about how much he had ignored in exchange for ease. My mother's side of the family reacted differently. Aunt Elena was gone by then, but her daughter Sophia sent me flowers with a note that read, "Your mother would have recognized you in this." I cried at that, not because I felt victorious, because grief and vindication make terrible but powerful neighbors. The trust recovery process took almost a year. Money came back in pieces. The shell company balances were clawed back first, then certain brokerage liquidations. Then a partial property-related recovery tied to the Galveston arrangement. When all was settled, not every dollar was recovered cleanly, but most of it was. More importantly, control was stabilized. I fired the old advisor. I hired a fiduciary who answered only to documented authority and who had the refreshing habit of treating charm as a due diligence problem. I sold the lake house in Conroe. That decision surprised some people. They assumed I would want to keep every asset my father had touched. But peace does not always look like preservation. Sometimes it looks like conversion. I used part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name at Prairie View A&M, Marisol Reyes Callaway First Generation Women's Scholarship. The first year, it funded 4 students at $12,500 each. That mattered to me more than restoring any single property. My mother had believed education made a woman harder to erase. I wanted her name attached to that truth permanently. I moved back into a real apartment with windows that faced west and filled with gold around 6:30 p.m. I bought a better mattress. I started sleeping through the night more often than not. I went to therapy every Thursday at 5 p.m. and said out loud things I had previously disguised as competence. Here is one of them. For 5 months, while I was building the case, I was terrified. Not once. Repeatedly. I woke up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing. I sat in parked cars after family lunches with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I doubted myself on Tuesdays for some reason. Always Tuesdays. Maybe because that was the day my father died. Maybe because the nervous system likes anniversaries even when the mind does not. I was not brave in the cinematic way people imagine. I was scared and methodical. That is different. And maybe better. 6 months after the plea agreement, I adopted a 3-legged rescue mutt from a shelter outside town. He was brown, one ear folded, suspicious of men in loafers, and impossible not to love. I named him Verdict because the name made me laugh, and my therapist said humor was a healthy coping mechanism as long as it did not become a hiding place. Aunt Colette and I started having lunch once a month. At first it was awkward. She carried guilt the way some women carry oversized handbags, constantly, and with terrible posture. She apologized more than once. I told her what my therapist told me. Guilt only helps if it turns into something useful. Colette surprised me. She began volunteering with a legal aid clinic that helps elderly fraud victims navigate guardianship abuse, estate theft, and coercive transfers. She was good at it. Patient. Attentive. She knew now how easy it was for a polished lie to get social traction. She knew witnesses are rarely neutral. They are simply untested. Diane took a plea. She did it to avoid trial because trials create transcripts and transcripts outlive charm. She received a prison sentence on the state charges, probationary supervision components afterward, restitution obligations, and federal disposition tied to coordinated financial conduct. Curtis was disbarred and sentenced separately. Trevor Fisk got home confinement and cooperation credit, which I privately found fitting. He ended up confined to his mother's guest room in Beaumont after the condo arrangement collapsed under seizure and forfeiture review. There is a kind of poetry in that no writer would dare overuse.